Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Whiskey Wednesday webcast from WhiskeyCast. We've been off for a few weeks, and it's good to be back. I know we've missed you almost as much as some of you have missed us. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskeyCast studio in Haddonfield, New Jersey, the charming yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. Hope you've been taking good care of yourselves during August and the first week or so of September. We are back now with our webcasts, Whiskey Wednesday and the Friday Happy Hour show. And it's good to be back. And of course, the weekly web podcasts each week. Hope you've had a chance to keep up with those. We have a great panel of guests for the next hour or so. And let's start bringing everybody in. We're going to bring in this is going to be fun here. We'll just bring everybody in all at once. Tracie Franklin, our pal from Glenfiddich originally. She has now left and has a brand new gig to talk about. Jane Bowie from Maker's Mark. And Garrett Oliver, a newcomer to the whiskey world on our side of things, the brewmaster at Brooklyn Brewery in New York, and the founder of the Michael Jackson Foundation for Brewing and Distilling. Garrett, first of all, let's talk about the foundation because I've been wanting to get you on the webcast for a few weeks now since you announced this. Tell us about the foundation and what your goals are.
Well, for your, thanks for having me here, and great to see everybody. And many people may not know the name, or at least not by, not for the same person. So, the actual name of the foundation, though we call it the Michael Jackson Foundation, is the Michael James Jackson Foundation, so we can distinguish him from some other Michael Jackson. But in the world of beer and whiskey, Michael Jackson was basically the biggest and most prominent writer in both beer and whiskey in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And really laid the foundation for almost everything about how we look at our beer scene today, particularly craft beer. And so this whole idea started off, about 20 years ago with a fund under the old American Institute of Wine and Food, if you might remember that. And it was the Michael Jackson Fund for Brewing and Distilling. Long story short, over the years, AIWF kind of went away, but the fund still existed. And I was asked to help administrate it. And I decided that if I was going to be involved, I wanted it to somehow go to help education for people of color, within the brewing and distilling industries. Michael was very much an anti-racist. He was very much somebody who helped me out and was a mentor to me during my career. And I know, and his family knows, that he would have loved to have seen this. So, we have a bit of a problem or a discrepancy, if you like, in the worlds of both distilling and brewing.
Oh, you can call it a problem. We have a problem.
Yeah, I think it's a problem.
Let's not beat around the bush here. It is a problem. And we'll talk with Tracie about this too.
And it's a problem that, we all have something to do with. Everybody wants to say, oh, well, it wasn't me. But in fact, even I had to take a look in the mirror and just say, well, why haven't I had any applicants for a brewing job, Black African American, for a brewing job in 30 years?
Wow.
I have sent Iraqis to brewing school, and I've sent Haitians to brewing school. I've sent people from other countries. I've sent Americans of other backgrounds to brewing school, but I've never even had an applicant, from the Black community in the United States. And there are reasons for that. And one of the many reasons involves, yes, we have very high standards of either education or experience. And when it comes down to both of those things, there are not many people out there with experience. About 1% or less of people in the brew houses in the United States are African American. And then you have on the technical side, where we're requiring experience or coursework, the coursework starts maybe for short courses at about $2,500. And if you're looking at UC Davis, you're looking at $16,000 for a population of people who have 10% of the household wealth of other Americans in the United States. So, even someone who is myself, a person of color, sitting in a chair where I could hire people, I actually had set up a system that virtually ensured that nobody of my own background would end up in front of me for this job. It wasn't intentional, but it's what happened. And so what we're looking to do with the Michael Jackson Foundation is very simple and very streamlined. There's only one thing we actually do. Well, two related things. The first thing is that we offer scholarship awards for people of color within the technical production side of brewing and distilling. We will have an accredited list. We're working with people like UC Davis and the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, and we hope to also work with the distilling industry to figure out what our accreditation list is, which will all be vetted pretty seriously. And then we send people out for these courses. You know, they will obviously apply to us through a scholarship as a normal scholarship. We will then pay the schools directly. The second part of it, however, is that every person who gets a scholarship will be assigned a mentor who will be a person of color within the industry. Preferably somebody who got in the last 10 years or so and can remember what it was like, you know, before they were a known person like myself, and can give, be a listening ear, give advice, but importantly also make connections. And so we are already starting off as a serious connection hub between all sorts of people, even before we've issued our first scholarship award. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind since I announced it on July 6th, but we've had more than 300 donors. We've raised about $160,000, and there's a lot more promised on top of that. And you know, that is going to allow us in the first quarter of next year to send our first scholarship awardees, you know, to their courses. And so what we're basically doing is producing the kinds of applicants that we wish to see. This is not the only way into the brew house. There are many, many ways that you can end up being a brewer, and they are all time-honored ways. Just like becoming a chef, you can go to cooking school, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and work your way up, you know, through the galley system in the kitchen, and both of them work. But the thing is that what we're doing is something that I already know how to do, and that I'm 100% sure will work. You know, if there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that if people go through these courses, they pass these courses, you take an American Brewers Guild course, yes, it does cost $9,000 for this course, but I've hired about 11 or 12 people out of that course because the course is so good.
And one of the things you're going to be able to do, add to your accredited list here soon of schools, is the Nearest Green School of Distilling at Motlow State College in Tennessee. And you've named one of the scholarships for Nearest Green. And Tracie is part of that Nearest and Jack Advancement Initiative as of this week.
Oh, awesome.
We saw Tracie on CBS This Morning the other day talking about it.
On Monday. It was amazing.
And we were waiting for you to land something, Tracie, after you left Glenfiddich this year. We knew you had something coming up, but we weren't quite sure what it was, but we knew it was going to be fun.
Right.
But seeing you with Fawn Weaver, I mean, oh, dear God, that's two forces of nature colliding.
And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to use those forces for good. Exactly like, oh, it's funny. I just kicked my light. Everyone was really waiting to see where I was going. I was a national ambassador for Glenfiddich single malt Scotch and just loved my world I was in. But I'd always, and you actually talked to me when we first had our first interview about distillation and the experience that I had in distillation. And that was something that stayed with me. I was always passionate about it. I was always trying to get into the lab or to go and work with the different stillmen. And this was an opportunity that came kind of out of left field. Fawn mentioned the school that she was building, and I immediately reached out and said, hey, how can I get into that school? Do you have a curriculum? Can I do it online? Like, I need that education. And she then took that to the next step and said, well, what are you interested in doing? What is the career that you want to take? How can I help you? And we really got to this point where she realized I had enough experience in distillation to know that it was something I wanted to pursue further. And now I am basically the head distiller apprentice for the Nearest and Jack Leadership Acceleration Program. The actual program fully itself is the Nearest and Jack Advancement Initiative, but there are 3 prongs. There's a small business incubation program for distilleries and small businesses of color. There is the Nearest Screen School of Distillation, which will be, like you said, at Motlow in Tennessee. And then there is the Leadership Acceleration Program. I am the first person candidate to be a part of the program, which is incredible and also very heavy. I want to ensure that this program is successful. It is a solution. Like Fawn Weaver saw a problem. She created a program that would then, just like you said, we are creating the candidates we want to hire. Because there was no way that this was going to be able to happen. There was a reason that we are underrepresented within the spirits and the brewery industries. We are going to be underrepresented, not just because of the experience, but also in the way that family it's a familial thing. You raise up your family through your distilleries, and if we don't have that, if that ancestry and that legacy has been cut off, we don't have those ties to kind of move up in the industry and to become that master distiller, because my dad was, which is not a bad thing. I think it's incredible and awesome, and we will honor those legends and traditions forever. But this new chapter will also be a little bit more colorful, a little bit more complete, and I'm really excited about that.
And we have a comment from Jamie Cotter on there. Wait, stall the ball. I missed the memo that Tracie left Glenfiddich. What else have I missed in 2020 now? Well, there was this pandemic thing, and we got this election coming up, and all sorts of fun stuff.
There's a lot. There's a lot. Sorry about that. Sorry, Jamie.
By the way, you can post your comments if you have something you'd like to add in the chat response areas on both YouTube, Periscope, and on our Facebook page. If you're watching on Twitter, don't respond to the tweet with this video link in it, because we won't see it till after the show, but we'd love to hear from you. And Chris Ratcliffe is going, this is a fantastic way to bring people into a career path they want to follow. Garrett, how much interest have you already had from people who want these scholarships?
Oh, it's been huge, and there are a lot of people who are sort of champing at the bit, to get going in this. The scholarship on the brewing side is named after Sir Jeff Palmer, who came over in the 50s from Jamaica originally, and became eventually the first Black professor in Scotland, and is very well known not only as a giant of brewing science in the UK, but also as one of the most tireless human rights campaigners and civil rights activists over the last 40 years. I've woken up recently to hear him interviewed on the BBC about the whole controversy about taking down statues and things like that. So it's just very funny that when you go to Scotland and you talk to brewers, basically Sir Jeff is known as God, and then you also hear him, on this side. So we're very proud to have him involved. And one of the things that he told me when we first got going with this, I said, he said, what are you going to do? I said, well, there are a lot of people, say somebody's working as an accountant right now, and they're really smart, and they've been a home brewer for years, and they'd like to become a brewer. We're going to get them to a brewing course, and we're going to bring them up through the ranks, and we're going to land them in a position as an assistant brewer somewhere. And Sir Jeff was like, no, don't do that. And I was sort of like, wait a minute, what do you mean? He's like, okay, you can do that eventually, but where you want to start, it was with people who have a foot in the door already. They're already working really hard. Maybe they were a dishwasher, or maybe they were behind the bar, or whatever, and they went over to the brewing side, but they have no actual technical background. There's no way their employer has filled in all the stuff they really need to know to advance as a brewer. So you might be able to make the beer, like somebody shows you, okay, this is the way you make this dish in a restaurant. But if you don't know, for example, how you blend lemon with cream and don't curdle it to make a sauce, if you just know, well, chef showed me how to do this, and you don't know any of the rest of it, so you can't make any adjustments, you will never move out of that position. So the first people that we're going to be giving the scholarships to over the first year or so will be people who are already do have one foot in and need to have a rocket booster attached to them. One thing I think is worth pointing out here also, and this is on the both brewing and particularly on the bourbon and whiskey side, is that, of course, African Americans were always doing the brewing and distilling.
Always.
They were always doing the brewing and distilling. So my good friend David Wondrich is going to be over here later, and a few weeks ago, he sent me a list which came from the census, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, of Black Americans who were listed in the census as distillers.
Yeah.
And there are dozens of them, and whether under slavery or after the Civil War, this is something which is a legacy, which of course we all know back through Nearest Green, but also dozens of others who have not been as fully recorded.
Absolutely. That's it. And that's why I'm actually really excited, is because there's this movement to now discover these distillers who were either enslaved or free, but to discover these people. And we're hopefully able to then add their contributions to these traditions. And I think that that's going to be a really, really wonderful and more complete industry, which why wouldn't we want that?
I want to bring Jane into this discussion because Jane's been sitting down there in the corner for the entire last few minutes or so, and we haven't had a chance to bring you into this. I want to ask how you got your start in the industry and how you got into this, because you had a non-traditional path too, right?
Yes, and I gotta say, I'm so excited to be on this. It's really inspiring, and I'm already thinking, like, Garrett, reach out. Let us know how we can help. But Tracie, listening to you talk reminds me a lot of kind of my journey. I started in advocacy 13 years ago, and I think the thing about that work as a brand ambassador, or you have a foot in sales, a foot in marketing, but you're expected to know enough about operations to not get your lunch handed to you every day, right? So I think there's not this natural corporate beautiful ladder for you in that role. And I remember realizing, okay, what happens when you want to do something else? And I was kind of like you. I loved operations. I don't have the science background. Most days I feel like it's that nightmare where you wake up in AP chemistry and you're like, I didn't sign up for this class, right? But I originally was like, I want to be a distiller. And then I learned what a distiller did. And I'm like, I don't want to be a distiller. Like, that's not what I want to do. I want to be the person that puts the whiskey in the bottle and comes up with the liquids and the ideas. And when I went to Glenfiddich, they're like, we don't innovate. Like, it's not a job here. So, but yeah, that's it. I think it's interesting. The industry is one of those, it's just a passion industry. And I think once it gets in your blood and under your skin, you can go, different directions and do different things. And I love hearing the different initiatives that you're going to get to experience, from the business to the distilling and the education piece. Because I think a lot of us just kind of, it still is a lot of on the jobs. I can't tell you how many kids show up and go, I have a chemical engineering degree, I want a job. And you're like, go be a third shift mash operator for a while. Like, that's, but yeah, it's really exciting to hear the things you guys are doing. And now, 13 years in, ambassador to managing a team to director of innovation and handling all the maturation and inventory and formulation at Makers now. So
you have the really good job. That's like, you have the job that everybody in the whole company wants to have. Which is, I would love to hear, from you, whether here or maybe more extensively, later on, just in emails or whatever else, what the resources are out there for education, technically, on the distilling side, because it seems like the distilling side is maybe 20 or 30 years behind the beer world, where it comes
for
to
sure
there being courses available that are real courses all over the place. It seems, I don't want to take everybody off into left field now, where we're going to be geeking out over the minutia, but we hold about 2,000 oak barrels at our, barrel storage, which doesn't sound like much to Makers, Mark.
No, it sounds like a lot.
For a brewer, that's actually a decent amount. So, I deal a lot.
That's a day's production at Makers.
with wood, and such. Well, people often don't look at a brand the size, the apparent size of Makers, and not realize that this is an art form where there are actual people sitting there and figuring this stuff out, so that you can make something as reliable and good as Makers actually is. And I think that there isn't a ladder, within this. But the important thing is that, and this already, it's like, plenty of people of color are already either enjoying our beer and our whiskey, or they would like to. But imagine imagine this, and I'm sure, you're decent, wonderful people, but imagine that every time you want to drink bourbon, in a place where the people really knew what they were doing and whatever else, or every time you wanted craft beer and you went into a place, every single person in that place was always black, and you're going in, as a European American. I mean, sure, you'd like to say that would be fine, but it would be weird.
I can't imagine it. Yeah.
It's really weird. Like, that's how weird it is for people of color walking into, your average cocktail bar or whatever else. So my point being is that once you have the people who are making, these things actually involved, they bring their friends, they bring their family, and then your market gets larger. You see all these people going out there and trying, like, let's try the latest hard seltzer. How about selling to the rest of Americans who are like the other 30 or 40%, which you could do if you just let them in the door a little bit. So, this has a very big commercial side to it as well. I mean, yes, maybe I'm coming more from a social justice, et cetera side, but it's so good for everybody's business.
Hey, no problem with that, except for the hard seltzer mention. We almost needed you for that. Hey, we got a great comment here from Chris Ratcliffe, and you can answer this one, Garrett. He loves the Brooklyn Brewery, and Chris is based in the UK, and he wondered if you'd ever distilled any of your stuff. Have you ever done any distilling collaborations?
Well, I have to tell you, I'll tell you a quick funny story. Right down the street from Brooklyn Brewery, about a 10-minute walk, is the New York Distilling Company, which is run by one of our founders, Tom Potter, who also later was the head of AIWF, together with Alan Katz, who you guys probably all know.
Yeah, no Tom.
They formed New York Distilling Company. So Alan and I know each other from old days of Slow Food, where we both sat on the original board back in the early 2000s. And, Tom and I go back to the late 80s, early 90s. And so those guys are right down the street from us. And we had a batch of beer. It was an 8% beer. Long story short, it ended up with a little bit of cork in each bottle, floating in the top of the beer. Completely harmless, but the bottles are now unsaleable. We were drinking them ourselves. They were fine. But you can't sell somebody a bottle with even a tiny little sliver of, a perfectly fine cork in it. So
it's fiber.
I made our team, who made the error that caused us to get the cork in the bottle. I made them all go down, and I went with them, and we uncorked thousands of bottles of this beer, which was an 8% beer, and we distilled it at New York Distilling Company. And after a few years, that stuff got really, really good. And so we are doing some things where we're, looking at some back and forth with them, and we've sent them some of our barrels. And of course, they just sent us 10 barrels last week for aging a special project. So a lot of back and forth, but I know that you guys, the makers of the world and the nearest screens of the world will do it best, but I hope to get my licks in there somewhere.
Hey, wait a second. Where is this? Is this still available anywhere? Because I want to try this.
I want to try.
I love your beer.
Yeah, we can certainly send you some. I think there's some still in barrels, and at this point, this is like 5 or 6 years old, so it's getting there.
You'll get my address when we're done here, but and pointing out on that whole idea that you pointed out, Garrett, about walking into a bar and being the only white person in a bar full of people of color. We have a comment from Bill Ricker. When in San Francisco in Chinatown, he absolutely did pick out a restaurant where they were the only European American table, kind of weird out of the tourists he was guiding.
Well, and that's a good point, but here's the difference. Two people, and that includes me, if I go into a restaurant and it's a Chinese restaurant and it appears to me to be full entirely of Chinese people. Now, I don't know, are they Chinese tourists? Are they Koreans actually? Are they Japanese? Like, I can't tell. But you tend to think, oh, this.
Be careful, Garrett. I know where you're going with that.
Yeah, but think of it on the whiskey and craft beer side. What does that say then?
Right.
Like, it doesn't really say the same thing that it might say, even if you're saying, okay, it's a little bit squirrely that you might judge a restaurant, because people from out of that culture appear to go there, at least that has some legitimacy. But in the case of whiskey and craft beer, it doesn't really work. Like, it's not even true. So, you know, it's just plain weird.
Yeah. So the way that kind of relates. So when I was coming in, when I got the role with Glenfiddich, immediately I was just wondering how is everybody going to perceive this? You know, not only am I American, I'm a woman, and I'm a woman of color, and I am your new ambassador. You know, I am your representation of single malt Scotch in the United States now. And luckily,
Wait a second, Tracie. I have heard you give the address to the Quake or to the haggis at the Keepers dinner. And guys, if you do a search on Keepers of the Quake New York dinner, ode to the haggis.
Yes.
To hear this thing that Tracie and Andy Weir from Aberlour, I think, did last fall. They did the most amazing address to the ode to the Quake from Robert Burns.
Address to the haggis.
Address to the haggis. It was stunning.
It was absolutely and it's funny because it is very traditional. It's something that you often do before you're eating your haggis, and it's done at all traditional sort of Scottish events, especially here in America, where, you know, it's definitely raised up as this prize time. Everybody knows every word. They know how it's supposed to sound. It's this deep Scottish brogue. It's this old school language. And so Andy starts, and we came up with this sort of point where I save him because he doesn't have a knife. And even when we were talking before this, I was like, well, maybe I'll just do it in like American. And he's like, no, you've got this. Like, you
got to stick the landing here.
That's the way you should. And
it's like you must always have. You know,
I had a sword though. It was
talking Crocodile Dundee. That's a knife.
Yes, I came out with the largest sword, and I went straight in, and everyone was just like, what is happening? But again, that was an opportunity for me to step outside of these expectations and to really make people think about what they were expecting, make them think about what Scotch whiskey is, what it represents. It is just a spirit, a beautiful spirit from Scotland that is here in the States, that we enjoy all of those flavors, those stories, those legends that are still being updated today. Like, we're still writing all of these stories. So we don't have to cling to what it used to be. Let's, and I love that you're in innovation, because that is what we're doing with the entire industry. So as we innovate, that has to include diversity. It has to include everyone. And as we do that, we're going to get more voices. People are going to start seeing themselves in those products, and we're going to have better whiskey all around.
And I think it's an industry that's... Oh, sorry.
Jane, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Tracie, I think it's interesting coming... I think it's an industry that's been reluctant to change, and it is. I live in Bardstown, and it's so-and-so's cousin and neighbor, and it is. And I think it's what makes it charming in some ways, but I also think like the industry's been pushed to innovate from a liquid, and that means across the board in every aspect. And I think you can still be grounded in tradition, but looking forward and not looking back. And it's inspiring to hear you talk about that. And just, the fact that you show up and instantly, like, the stereotype of what you expect someone who's going to talk about Glenfiddich, right? Like, it's, but you had to work harder to make sure you were credible. Like, that was always 25-year-old Jane in England teaching people about whiskey. Like, you had to, like, really know your shit, right? Like, people are going to want to call for all the time.
100%.
I love it.
We got a question for you, Jane. Go ahead, Garrett. I think
people don't expect, my last book was the Oxford Companion to Beer for Oxford University Press. And through that, I was like, when I went to do the author photo for that, I'm like, okay, let's try and look good. Cause people aren't going to see this coming. And when I was drafted a few years ago to be the person on stage giving away the awards at the Scottish beer awards, and that is where I met Sir Jeff. And so me and Hardeep Singh, who is an Indian guy, turban, actually Sikh, everything, and of course the full everybody except for maybe me. I wasn't able to go there because I couldn't get fully fitted out for my kilt in time. I was one of the few people there who wasn't fully dressed up. But I'll tell you what, Hardy looked great, and I am sure that you looked awesome because it turns out that we look pretty good in tartan.
Absolutely.
Now, I have neglected to ask the question we usually start this thing off with these webcasts. What's in your glass, guys? Because I know Jane's been drinking stuff, and I know Tracie's got a glass, and Garrett, I'm assuming you've got something handy by to drink.
Oh, you have no idea how many things.
Garrett, come on.
Yeah, maybe that Pennant 55 ale that Crumpler likes.
I didn't want to give any, any offense to, any of our guests and their backgrounds in different drinks, and especially knowing that our friends at Brewers are supporting your broadcast. So I thought I wouldn't show up. I have a full set of. I have scotches over there. I have five mezcals that I can see. I have several cognacs. I have. I mean.
Well, go pull something and pour yourself a glass. Garrett, we don't stand on ceremony around here, because one of the things I have always made it a point of is I don't drink anything from any of our guests while we're doing it, just to not play favorites. And so let's go around. Tracie, what do you got?
So I picked up the Jack Daniel's number 27, the gold. So finished in the maple wood. Yeah, delicious. I mean, they're paying. This is the thing.
Yeah, they're paying
for me to get this education that I have been dying to get. I am in chemistry courses, general chemistry, organic chemistry, Six Sigma, OSHA, HACCP. Like, they are empowering me to be able to do everything I've ever wanted to do. I have mentors at distilleries I've dreamed about going to, and people that I've looked up to my whole life that I can now text message questions. So I am going to support them for the rest of my life. Jack Daniel's and Uncle Nearest, no matter what, because they've made my dreams come true. So yes, Jack Daniel's in my glass currently, and Uncle Nearest on deck.
And how amazing,
hey, what do you got?
Tracie.
Well,
sorry. Oh.
Wait a second, Garrett. Let's let Jane go ahead.
I just want to comment on the fact that you're going to get to go see this traditional story distillery and work there, and then also this brand new distillery that's coming in, and the juxtaposition, like, that's going to be pretty amazing to see how their approaches and North Stars and everything's really different. I want to keep up with you just to hear how that goes. But
all right.
I'm drinking Maker's Mark. Shocker. I'm actually drinking this year's 2020 wood finishing series, and then I'm going to do some homework where I bring innovation home that's still in development to see how it drinks in a social environment. So that's kind of on deck.
And I got a sample of it the other day, as I'm showing right here. I'll have my tasting notes for it on the podcast this weekend. Spoiler alert, I like it.
I wasn't going to do this, but now
okay, Garrett, what do you got?
So this is Four Roses small batch, pulled directly from the wood at the brewery. So as the barrels come in, and we'll get about 250 barrels in at a time, it turns out there's a tiny amount of whiskey in the bottom of each barrel. And, the Four Roses small batch is made of 4 different bourbons that are blended together, at bottling time. And we had a representation because our Black Ops is aged in Four Roses small batch barrels. And therefore, every one of us on the brewing team got a cut, and being brewmaster, of course, my cut is rather large. As
it should be.
Of straight Cask-Strength bourbon, and I have to say, we just let it settle. We don't even filter it, and this at somewhere between, I guess, 105 and 120 proof is pretty magnificent. So, cheers.
Slange back.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Mark, what did you drink?
For the record, I started out, before we started with that Maker's, the wood finishing series, but I switched over. A buddy of mine has a Lafroig single cask.
Nice.
That is an 8-year-old single cask that he acquired and brought over this year. And I've got a case of it.
What?
How is it at 8 years old?
It's an 8-year-old quarter cask because I don't want to go into the whole story here, but it was he is a longtime friend of a distillery employee at Laphroaig who retired and was given the cask for his retirement. And my friend acquired the cask, had it bottled, and I now have several bottles of this, but it's a Cask-Strength 8-year-old Laphroaig that's really good.
Fiery.
And I know that there's a good chance that there may have been some makers involvement with there, because I know that a lot of the makers barrels go over to Laphroaig now. But I wanted to bring up this comment that we got earlier a few minutes ago from Jamie Cotter, who is at Hinch Distillery in Ireland and got some casks from you guys for casks for their cask program. They got some makers casks too. So it's going to be interesting to see how their whiskey tastes in makers casks.
We're just so grateful that there's a market for used cooperage. So,
you're tired of those planters, huh?
Furniture, coffee tables, yeah. No.
How much bourbon furniture? How much bourbon barrel furniture do you have in the house?
Yes, good question.
Well, I mean, what I found,
An
this is
obscene
an
amount.
interesting thing, and certainly these guys know this, but and all your viewers know that why all of these come out of the bourbon industry. But the thing that was a surprise to me is that a lot of these barrels used to be cheap, and as the prices started going up and up and up, we thought, okay, we're competing with other brewers, which was true. But the people we were actually competing with, and she'll know this, is China and India. So as China and India have more disposable income, it turns out that one of the first things that people want almost everywhere in the world, once they get a little disposable income, is they would like some whiskey and they would like some meat. Almost everywhere. And those two things kind of go together, and people want to make good whiskey. So they're, India and China make more whiskey than anybody else in the world, but they haven't traditionally been all that good. And why? Because they don't have the oak. So how are they going to make better whiskey? They're going to get the oak. And they're going to get the same oak that we were getting. So we are actually now competing directly against Chinese and Indian buyers who are looking to buy bourbon barrels in particular and whisk them off to another part of the world. And I wish them the best of luck. But it's so very funny that that this has become a global market now. They're not so cheap anymore.
And it happened so rapidly.
It did, Tracie. You're right. It was just overnight. It felt like.
And our pal Whiskey Canuck up in Canada has a Glenfiddich IPA experimental pour that I know you were involved with, Tracie. But one more dram until that's a dead soldier.
He's done. Oh no. That's my summer whiskey for sure. It was so bright and vibrant and zesty. Yeah.
I love the experimentation side. I'm sure that you're working on things like this at Makers. This that I'm also drinking from Highland Park is Dark Origins, which is made partly from a mash that has crystal malt in it. So you have this highly caramelized malt, and so some of these flavors are playing through the new mixed spirit, into there. So what I'm wondering is, what are the things that you can actually talk about? Come on, you want to tell us that you're working on at Makers, or that you've been thinking of that you can actually speak about?
Wait a second. I have a listener comment here before Jane answers that. Chris Ratcliffe, what does innovation mean at Maker's Mark? Can you ever play with Margie Samuels' mash bill? Never heard it put quite like that before. But go for it, Jane. Tell them what you do.
So our approach to innovation, I have two job objectives. One, I'm not allowed to throw shit against the wall, and number two, nothing's allowed to taste bitter. So, everything we do, we break out innovation into two sections. The first, when you think about whiskey, here's what's so amazing about what we do: it's agriculture, right? So I grew up in Kentucky, born and bred, love the bluegrass state, and when you think about, I work on an 1,100 acre farm every day. And if you were to put a nutritional label on these bottles, it's water, yeast, grains, wood. Like, that's all it is. It's a natural product. So half of my time is really spent diving into the agriculture and looking at these ingredients and the water. And we've got an oak repository, and we're actually mapping the white oak genome to protect the species and thinking about how that product will live on and understanding where the flavor comes from. So if I could figure out how to find genetically grown white oak species that had more lignin and lactone, like sign me up, but not happening. And then on the grain side, we're looking at farming practices and the role of the actual variety versus how the farming practices work and sustainability with that. So with agriculture, it's really about where flavor comes from and understanding. We are growing experimental wheat. We have our own lake and water source. We're studying kind of the pH and the chemistry of that all the time to really understand the role of water. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around water. I think we want to romanticize it. If you ask Denny Potter, our master distiller, he's like, it's free. That's why he likes it. So, but the yeast loves it, right? It's good for pH. And then on the other side of innovation, it really is about understanding some of the choices they made from a process standpoint and pushing flavor to the max. We're big on natural ingredients and understanding where flavor comes from and pushing those as far as we can. So I do think people will be surprised at what's going to come from us over the next few years because we're exploring and we're diving into the DNA of makers. So Margie and Bill set the tone for everything, but we are pushing some boundaries, especially for us as a distillery that didn't traditionally innovate in the same way as everybody.
Yeah, because I remember the common quote that Bill used to make, or Bill Jr. used to make whenever he did a speech was, the one thing my daddy always promised me was, don't screw it up, or told me was, don't screw it up.
Don't script the whiskey.
And,
that's still our job.
Yep. And I got a feeling Bill Sr. did not use the term screw in that comment. I got a feeling there was another word in there.
We're okay with profanity at Maker's Mark sometimes. Yeah, it's good.
I think, that's pretty prevalent throughout the industry. Yeah,
it's an industry trait for sure.
How do you innovate without screwing it up?
My thistle is well represented here in my.
I love it. Yes.
In my glassware, so
I like that.
Thank you for calling that out.
Yeah, I got I have a large sort of antique glassware collection. Of small, they can be whiskey glasses, cognac glasses, whatever you think. And so, in other years when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, I'd be in about a dozen countries. And it's very funny that everywhere that I go, all the folks in the antique shops know me. Because I go in there and they're like, oh, how's it going at the brewery? Like all these little glasses to drink all my good stuff in.
They see you coming and the price goes up 10%, right?
Well, it's like, I'm willing. I'll help them out.
Yep, because people see me going into a liquor store and the price goes up 10% for me. So.
Well, you got to work your way up to the point where the price goes down to zero. That's the good
right.
I have a feeling that you're already there. People aren't sending you cases of whiskey because you just happen to have bought it.
No, because the guy that got this has been a longtime friend of ours, and as a matter of fact, I'm helping shooting the video for his daughter's wedding next week.
Oh, that's really sweet. That's
wonderful.
So it's been a long time friendship. So one thing that surprised Chris when he went to the Maker's Distillery was the advertising posters around the bottling line. He'd love to see those in a book at some point. And I know there's been several books written about Makers, but I don't think the posters have ever made it into all the books, has there?
I don't think the history of the advertising has been really interesting. And that really came from Bill Jr.'s brain. I mean, he was a pure marketer in a lot of ways. And, it's interesting, the generational, the family piece, and each one from, mother and father to son to grandson, and how that's the evolution of Makers, I guess. But can I ask Tracie a question?
Sure, go for it.
I'm fascinated by, so have you started your program yet, or you're just getting ready to start?
All right. So I've actually been in the program for quite a while. We had to wait for the announcement. It was a CBS exclusive. So there's been a lot going on in the news, if you haven't noticed.
No.
It got delayed quite a bit. So what's happening is basically once I got hired and approved. So the first few people for the program will be nominated basically by people in the companies. Then we were vetted by a board that is employees from both Jack Daniel's and Uncle Nearest. And then basically they were like, okay, cool, you pass. What do you want to do? Because it's not just distilling. People might want to go into warehouse management. They might want to do distillery management. They may want to do director of innovations, things like that. So each person is going to have their own sort of curriculum when they come into the programs, they'll assign you your mentors, which is where I'm really excited about that. I will be having the hands-on experience of going to different distilleries throughout the United States. Very different styles, not all bourbon, not all Tennessee, not all rye. So it's going to be a mix of all of those different sizes, different capacities. So each head distiller or master distiller will also have a very different role, because head distiller is a very, very large role. That is a title that doesn't really distinguish what you do. So I want to see what that looks like in every different distillery and then create what that is for me. I also want to ensure that I have the most knowledge and experience I can when I come out, so that when I do head to a distillery, when somebody says, great, we're going to hire you now, that I'm able to really fit into that experience, into that distillery, and be an ideal candidate to move up into the position of head distiller. I've been studying chemistry. So I actually signed up for chemistry course, an organic chemistry course, Six Sigma, OSHA, HACCP, the GCD, General Certificate of Distillation, which your people will have to take, Garrett. Just anything that's up. I'm part of the American Craft Spirits Association. So their seminar and all of their different seminars that they came out with, just studying every single one. Anything that I can find that is going to empower me until I can start getting into distilleries, I'm taking. I'm just grasping with both hands and absorbing as much as I possibly can.
I love that you're seeing the
Jane,
less
you can hook her
glamorous.
up with Denny, right?
I would love for you to come. So Denny's always like, it's a marketing title. So I love that, like,
right,
you're saying, hey, I'm going to go see, am I going to be the ops person? Am I going to be maturing inventory? Like an Andrea Wilson, who's amazing, right? Who I'm going to go be VP of operations and do this, or am I going to be in the distiller? Like the fact that you're doing Six Sigma courses is like they're showing you the non-glamorous parts too. Because I always tease Denny. People are like, master distiller. I'm like, he manages slop and cattle feed for a living. Like, let's be honest about your job, right?
Got to get rid of
that. No, I think and yeah, please come visit us. We would love to have you. And I just, what's been the most surprising for you that's been interesting or you didn't expect? Because I'm sure you're learning so much that there's been things that.
I'm just going to sit back here.
I'm fascinated by this.
Well, honestly, what has been the most fascinating is that I know more than I thought I did. It has been stepping into this and learning and going, but I know this, I know that. Oh, good. And realizing that all of this, because all this time I wanted to ensure that I was good enough to be an ambassador, that I was good enough to stand in front of people and to break down this process and these creations of flavor chemically, because I didn't want anyone to be able to second guess me. So I know this. I don't necessarily know it as deeply as a chemical engineer would, but I'm working really hard to get close. And even if I don't, that's okay. How many distilleries do we know that were opened by somebody who just had a lot of money and they don't know anything about the process and just hired a consultant to come in and set them up, but they can't make any adjustments. They can't fix anything. So I don't want to be that person, but I honor that is how some distilleries start, and that is how some distillers get their start. And that's wonderful. I want to come in kind of differently with a huge amount of experience and knowledge that I'm packed into, like this. Fawn Weaver calls it a microwave distiller. With a ton of education and as much hands-on experience as I can, that I can then take in, so that once I get to know that distillery, I can improve any system I'm walking into.
Tracie, I've known you for years, and I knew you knew your stuff already.
Thank you, Mark.
So this is great.
That's going to make you super, super extra powerful, because I think that, for both you and Jane, you kind of see that knowing what's going on in cocktail bars, knowing what's going on in marketing, understanding how people are actually consuming what it is that you're drinking. The fact that I'm doing so much communication actually goes back into what I do creatively, and it will for you too. I mean, you will make different decisions than somebody who was a pure chemical engineer. Yeah. And if you ask me about fermentation, I know a lot about fermentation. I mean, I could go, all day. But if you ask me, write out right now the Krebs cycle, and write out, this branch of fermentation, in chemical signature and whatever else. Well, I've forgotten most of that a long time ago, but that's not what I'm using every day. If you want to know, like, how do I make something taste like this within this time frame in a natural fashion? What things are going to make yeast move this way? What's the difference between maker's wood and, you know, and somebody else's wood? You know, what am I getting from a barrel between microoxygenation, you know, previous tenants of the wood, you know, the way the wood was handled, et cetera. Like, that's the stuff that I know, so I can actually make the things that people don't even know that they want yet, because I can see through everything in a way, you know, into the future, and I can see people in the environment sitting at their bars, because, you know, the things that we make don't live in a lab. You know, they live around people's tables and at bars and in real environments. And you talk to a lot of people who just have nothing but, you know, but school learning. And they're surprised when I talk about what I call face paint, you know, which is when you see somebody come down off stage, you know, in the theater, their makeup will look to you close up and it's like garish, right? Well, you know, and I'm sure that Jane knows this. If you don't build some flavor spikes or aromatic spikes, you know, into the thing that you're making, then when you get into the real world, which is not a lab and is not aromaless and is not noiseless, you know, your very subtle thing can disappear completely into the background. So, you know, it's sort of like talking to sound engineers who will take their album and get in the car and drive around with it. What does it listen like? What does it sound like on a car radio? If you don't know what your beer or your whiskey tastes like in a bar, you have no idea what it tastes like at all, you know? And so all these things, you know, having been a brand ambassador, you know, counts for a lot. And I'm sure that Jane's background, similarly, you know, you bring all of you to what it is, you know, that you're doing and how you're doing it to create a better version, you know, of a distiller or a brewer.
Yes.
We have a great question here that ties in perfectly to this. Graham Fraser in Scotland asks, I'm fascinated by the impact of yeast on whiskey. How important do the guests feel yeast is in the final product? And well, let's apply this to beer as well for Garrett. But let's talk about the yeast, because that's really, when you talk about Four Roses, for instance, as you pointed out, Garrett, that's where the yeast makes all the difference, because they've got 5 different yeasts they use to bring out different flavors.
5 different yeasts that they know about perfectly. And then there's the ambient ones. I will tell you only this from the beer side, you know, because I know a lot about this, but these guys know more. But when we tasted the whiskeys that had the different, you know, yes, they have different new mixed spirits, but then there are a couple of different yeast strains, you know, going also into these. You could tell instantly which beer came from which wood. And in some cases, the only toggle was the yeast strain. So, you know, if you have a yeast strain, for example, that creates isoamyl acetate, which, you know, people will see as banana or circus peanut or whatever else, that plays through then into the new mixed spirit. That does get distilled through, it gets into the wood, and then it comes back out. You know, so whether it's, you know, and you have all these different, you know, these different things, all these different compounds that are being created by yeast that can play through. And even, I'm like the third user here, like, you know, I'm taking stuff coming out of the wood and out of that whiskey back into a beer, and I can taste the yeast. So, you know, you guys must like have so many things to work with.
Well, and again, so I believe that the impact of the yeast is dependent on the distiller and what they believe the impact of the yeast is. Because if you're choosing to there are cuts that can be made during distillation that can necessarily minimize the effect of the yeast and can really hone in instead on that distillery spirit in a different way. But fermentation, as we know, is where you're creating so many of the bases of your flavors. Like, we know that it's important, but if we decide that we don't want the fermentation process to be where we create the distinct flavors of our whiskey, I mean, instead we want it to be more of our baseline and consistent, then you might make different choices than if you're experimenting and using all different styles of yeast and really making choices to highlight what is created during fermentation, which is then going to change chemically in that fermentation, in that maturation process, where we know that some of that oxygen and things affects flavor that was created in fermentation. So it's a difficult question because there's so many choices to be made that affect the impact of flavor from every single layer within whiskey making.
And it's not linear. I like how you said that. It's not linear. We talk a lot about this because I think people want to go, like, we bat around, 50 to 70% of the flavor in bourbon comes from oak. And then, and 15%, who knows? Like,
right.
Make
yep.
that shit up. Right. So, but it's not linear. It's integrated. So to your point, the yeast you choose, the set temperature you choose, the amount of sour mash you use, the environment you're giving that yeast, from the pH level to the time you're going to allow it to, some people let it ferment more out than others, right? And then what you're doing with it, and then how. So I think it's, from our standpoint, it's a huge, to your point, Tracie, like, all the flavors created during fermentation, the still is just there to pull that flavor out or get rid of that flavor, right? Yep. That's all. It's just concentrating it. That's it. But we've been actually looking a lot at not only strain, but like those set temperatures and how you're actually impacting the fermentation itself. Because there's also the balance. It's a business, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yield matters. Like, how much. So it's that combination of flavor versus efficiency and function, and what are we doing to get the best to work the most. And it's interesting, one of the things we've seen, and Mark, you could probably talk about this a million times better than I can. It's been really interesting. Sour mash is such a traditional process in our industry, and going back, Denny would be like, it's free. Sweet mash, right? Like, you look at a lot of these new craft distillers that, Garrett, have more of a brewing mentality, because distilleries are clean, but they're not clean the way a brewery is clean. And so it's interesting, like, sweet mash is really about, we're going to have more of that clinical mentality, and you're seeing more of that. And it's really fascinating, people's different approaches to that. Like, what have you seen in the sweet mash family, Mark, that you're liking or not liking, or can you?
Well, I don't mind sweet mash. The problem is consistency, because you just don't get the consistency from batch to batch in sweet mash.
It's a lot of work, sweet mash.
I think that one thing you see, I mean, certainly there's a whole wing, and we could go off on this. I'm going to have to leave you in a couple of minutes, because people coming over to have cocktails. No, like David.
He's got David Wondrich coming over. He's got more important people than us.
Do you know Zeb Glesta, who used to run the bar at the Modern before the pandemic? He's coming over. So we're going to be. I'm going to be hosting people for cocktails, distanced on my roof. But look, I mean, what's fascinating about all of this, and I give talks on this, which is a fun subject, is that what's going on in American food, what's going on in bread and whiskey and beer and wine are all the same thing. We are largely looking to recover from an industrialized food system, the one that I grew up in, which I call the Matrix, where all the bread and all the cheese and all the other stuff was all basically fake. And our vegetables were all frozen and whatever else. And everybody's looking to get back to reality, which is natural things. You look at the Noma Guide to Fermentation becoming a best-selling book, a really, really geeky, expensive book about fermenting stuff in your house. You could never have sold that book 10 years ago. This is, what you see happening in natural wine, what you see happening in sour beers, what you see everybody. There are people in San Francisco now hanging sourdough starters literally in the trees for neighbors to come by and get. People are geeking out on fermentation in every single aspect of it. And what they want is not necessarily a straight up clean lab fermentation, but they want something that represents a reality of terroir around them. Whereas at one time we saw that perfect cleanliness was progress, and Wonder Bread was Wonder Bread because it was progress. We now look back on those things and we're like, yeah, I guess it was perfect in a way, but we missed something, and we want all the funk back. Yeah. And so whether it is talking about a hogo and rum, or Rancio playing through in a real way in cognacs. Mezcal, which is all about varietal and every single little thing going on. I think that within all the disciplines of food and drink, you're seeing the same story of people being more interested in nature and the influence of the artist in everything.
Garrett, I've got to hook you up with the guys at the Bread Lab at Washington State University because they're working in the Pacific Northwest with local barley strains. And what they've done is they're getting outside of the commodity barley system. They're growing these heirloom strains of barley that actually produce more yield per acre than the commodity strains that we're used to working with and have better flavor.
Stephen Jones is amazing.
Wow.
I'm making beer from Fonio now. Fonio is a Central African grain, one of the many grains and many foods that were stripped away by colonial powers as they came in and said, we want you to grow this, which doesn't even really grow here. Fonio is a traditional millet type. And it turns out that when you make beer from Fonio and you ferment it naturally, you have a bunch of precursors that turn out for a beer that smells like Gewürztraminer and has all these other layers of flavors and aroma that we were completely unfamiliar with. But of course, people have been making beer from Fonio for thousands of years, but we don't know anything about Fonio because we're Americans and we don't get out that much. And so there's just so much to work with that on both the distilling and the brewing side, the possibilities are endless. So I'm gonna go get my glasses together.
Wait a second, Garrett, we've had a request from Graham Fraser. He wants you to invite your guests to come down and sit in on the stream. Wondrich has been on this webcast before. He can join us. Bring your folks.
Probably, I think we're gonna get straight to the drinking, but this time,
Sure.
but maybe another time where you can invite him and I'll come on.
Of course.
And I'll be quiet while Dave tells stories.
We'll let you go now, Garrett. Hey, thank you for doing this, Garrett. Thank you for joining us. I know you only had an hour or so, so we will talk later. And next time I get up to Brooklyn, I'm coming to see you guys. I want to see what you're up to over there.
Well, nice to meet. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Nice to meet you.
And Jane, and we have a bunch of things to talk about. So let's
and you guys were all on the same email chain setting this up, so you can all communicate with each other.
We are all connected.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome.
Okay, Garrett,
everybody.
give everybody our
Bye,
best
Garrett.
up there, and we'll talk soon.
All right, ciao.
Okay,
Bye.
ciao. So let's keep going here since we've got some great comments here, and Casks and Ashes points out graceful decline there, Garrett. Well done. Yes, Garrett's a professional. He's done this before. So, Tracie, I got to ask, what prompted you to decide that you wanted to make to get into the serious end of this in the first place? Because you could have just as easily coasted along as a brand ambassador for decades, because I've seen you at tastings and you're good at the brand ambassador side of things. But what prompted you to get into this side of it?
Well, I think even stepping into the brand ambassador side, it was also about making an impact in the industry. Representation matters. And while I was, being able to be that representation for Scotch whiskey as the Glenfiddich ambassador, I saw an opportunity to step into the American whiskey world. And this is where I live. This is home. And we all know that there is a disparity in the amount of representation we have in the American whiskey industry. And this opportunity to not just come into the whiskey category, back to American whiskey, just working in it as an ambassador, but to actually be a part of creating change in the liquid, of being able to bring ideas that maybe nobody else has brought. And that diversity is going to really do that for the entire industry. And being the first person to set this path for this program. So the Nearest and Jack program is going to kind of be written based on what I do and what I think is successful and what is not. And it's going to continue based on my success. And it's a big burden, but it's also an opportunity for me to be able to create change and to solve a problem that we see in the industry. And I had to take that opportunity.
And we have to point out that Jane is juggling family at home too. So she had to step away for just a second here. But
Sorry.
that's perfectly.
The
No, that's
TV
perfectly.
Are
Hey,
you? Please no.
the
we're all working
pandemic,
from home. It's okay.
the TV has become a babysitter during my pandemic. The things you say you'll never do, and then a pandemic changes all that. But I
Yeah.
did get to hear you, Tracie, and I think it's just what an opportunity. I mean, something that any of us would dream about, and it's really like I think we're all excited to follow your journey, or I know I am. I'm gonna probably start stalking you a little bit, but no, and I think it's those opportunity. It's an industry that is very welcoming in a lot of ways, but it is hard sometimes if you're an outsider, because it's such a family, and it is wonderful, but that makes it challenging sometimes, right? I mean, it does. So
Absolutely. I think I'm really lucky that I do have both sides of the coin. Like you said, with Jack Daniels, I have this old tradition, going back with Jack and his family. And then on the other side, I have Fawn Weaver, who created this brand new brand based on this story with Jack Daniel and Nathan Nearest. But she is such a spitfire. Like you said, she's a force of nature. And so I get to kind of lean on both sides and make sure that either way I'm going, like I'm supported, and I can reach back and ask people at Jack Daniels how to get by, like how to really make sure I'm honoring the legacy and traditions. But I can also know that Fawn is empowering me to make my own choices and to really create a new way, a new path in this industry. So
what an entrepreneur. Yeah. I mean, you're going to learn what entrepreneurship really is from someone like her, for sure.
Now, Jane, I want to bring you back around to the wood, because we talked with Garrett about the yeast side of things, but what you've done with your wood innovations is something unusual, especially for makers, which has been, as you pointed out, so stayed for so many years in that they didn't want to screw with the original recipe.
Yeah.
But in the recent years with Makers 46 and then the Cask-Strength and now the wood finishing series and the private select bottlings, tell me what you're doing with those, because let's explain what you're doing with those.
Please.
With the private select, or just all of the wood finishing?
Let's start with the private select, because the wood finishing grew out of that, right?
Yeah, so the wood finishing 46 is kind of the father of all of this. And I think what's interesting is how we innovate at Makers. I think someone said, how do you know what success looks like? And I think we are very diligent on defining that. Like I said, my number one job objective, I'm not allowed to throw shit against the wall. What does that mean? It means we start with a taste vision. Our founders were actually very innovative. Makers was very pioneering when you go back to the 50s. And they started with a taste vision. And I always think Bill and Margie wouldn't have rested on their laurels. They would have kept probably pushing and going. But with 46, he had a really specific taste vision, and he was really married to what it was going to taste like. He wasn't necessarily married to the process he had to use. So this stay finishing, which hadn't really been done before in whiskey, John Glaser had done a similar thing with Spice Tree before he switched to hybrid barrels. But it was really more of a wine technique where they were using staves, inner staves in the barrel to get additional flavor into the product. So we wouldn't have chosen that process. It's labor intensive. It's expensive. We're only finishing these whiskeys for on average 9 weeks. But 46 was the first, and it really was about what he wanted that whiskey to taste like versus the processes we were going to use. So everything begins with the taste vision. Private select, Tracie, talking about your role, and Garrett mentioned this, consumers, what do they want? And they're not shy about telling you, right? I mean, retailers and bar people are not shy. So single barrels have been around for 1 million years. We were the absolute last of the heritage distilleries to the game. And the reason was we just didn't feel comfortable doing a traditional single barrel, because our big thing, Mark, as you said, it's consistency, right? Sour mash, it's consistency. We still rotate barrels. We are going to rotate about 170,000 barrels by hand this year.
Wow.
And is it good or bad? It's neither. It's our process. It's what we do for consistency. So the idea of rolling out 5 barrels, Tracie, and going, here, choose your favorite and we'll bottle it for you. It just didn't make sense for us, because it would have felt really disingenuous. So what we decided to do, the whole thing with 46 is he didn't want to reinvent the wheel. His exact words were, I wanted to create a maker's mark for my palate. And I'm sure you've thought about it. I don't know how many years you were with Glenfiddich, but you said like that IPA was your summer jam, right? We all, as we drink whiskey, think if I were going to make this whiskey for my palate, I would do it this way. And we kept thinking about, what if you could give customers that? What if you could actually let them come in and understand where all the flavor comes from in your distillery and your product, and let them create their own taste vision, just like our founders did, and let them make an expression, a single barrel of bourbon that actually is what they want and what they love about the whiskey. And that's what we did. So we worked for a long time. It was my first baby with Independent Safe Company. And we deconstructed makers, and we looked at taste, we looked at texture, we looked at finish, and we designed with them. I say we designed. They're the wood experts. We just said we want it to taste like this. They did all the hard, heavy lifting. But each stave was designed to push the whiskey into a specific flavor camp. So the idea is you can come in and go, I want a spice forward caramel maker's mark. And you go, great. We're going to use these different woods, and we're going to build a single barrel that's going to be unique for you. So that's, everything starts with, what do we want it to taste like? And then we work with them to cook the wood, source the wood, season the wood, tweak it. This last product was a blend. We used different woods with different aging weeks, and then we put the batches of bourbon together. So it's been fun. We've learned a lot. And then we've realized how little we actually know along the way.
Yep.
We have another question from Chris Ratcliffe. How did the Cask-Strength 46 come about? Was it customer demand or a curiosity that turned out well? You'd been selling that one at the distillery and in Kentucky for a while, but it just went national a few weeks ago.
We had big plans. So Makers 46 turned 10 in July, and Bill Samuels Jr. turned 80 in June. And so we had planned to do kind of a fun little tour and celebrating 10 years of 46, celebrating 80 years of the man who not only put Makers on the map, but has done a lot for our industry, I think. And we had plans around it, and obviously it didn't happen, but I love that bourbon at Cask-Strength. I think proof is an avenue for flavor. So if you drink classic 46 at 94 proof, it's very vanilla forward. It's very cinnamon. The Cask-Strength is more dried fruit and caramel and nuttiness. So it's a great whiskey. Maybe we'll try again next year. 81 is interesting too, right? That's good. 11 years, 81. So
I have to acknowledge that Bill Samuels Jr. is one of my favorite people in the whiskey business. I remember one of my first distillery visits was to Maker's Mark years ago, but a couple of years after that was the infamous Makers Ambassadors Party at Caesar's Palace in Vegas.
Oh, that was a good one.
Which was the Roman toga party on Saturday night. Bill comes out in this Cardinals outfit with the cassock and the Cardinals hat from the Catholic Church and everything. And I'm just waiting for the lightning bolts to come down. I mean, lightning bolts have never rained down on Las Vegas, but Bill Samuels wearing a Catholic Cardinals cassock and hat, I thought was going to bring down the lightning bolts that night. But that was, I'll admit, there are no pictures of it, thank God. But it was the only night I've ever been seen in a toga in my entire life.
So can I tell you, Tracie, you'll love this story about, this is how close-knit the industry is. So do you know how Bill Jr. ended up back at Maker's Mark? Have you ever heard this story? So he was studied aeronautical engineering. He went to grad school, Caltech, Berkeley, blew up a building, got kicked out, came back and decided to go to law school at Vanderbilt. And the Maltlows had their corporate office for Jack Daniels across the street from where he was at law school. And I never always forget, was it Lem or Hap who was younger, but whichever, they were running the office. And so they were great friends with Bill's dad, Bill Sr. And when Bill Sr. started Maker's Mark, he went to all his friends and he said, I'm going to pull the best brains and I'm going to build this brand with the help of all of my friends. And the Maltlows were very instrumental of how we built Maker's Mark. So Bill's at law school. He's going across the street to eat lunch with the Maltlows because it's a free lunch every day. And he's hanging out in their office for 3 years. He's hanging around the Jack Daniels office. And at the end of those 3 years, they're like, Bill, what are you doing in law school? Like, clearly you're passionate about whiskey. You should go work for your dad. And Bill's like, I didn't have the heart to tell them. I wasn't passionate about whiskey. I just wanted like a free lunch and to hang out like between, you know. And so he ended up, they were the ones that talked him into going back to work for mom and dad at Maker's Mark. And so we always, if you ever come to our main conference room, there's actually pictures of them because they were instrumental. Like our industry is such a close net.
It is so small.
I have never heard that story before. I've heard the story about Bill as a rocket scientist blowing up rockets all over Southern California. But I have never heard that story before.
He has a law degree from Vandy, which is always like mind-boggling. But he did patent law. He studied patent law.
Oh, neat.
So, but yeah. So we always like Jack. Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah.
And yeah, actually, I dipped my own makers. I've got all that fun stuff over in there. Like you guys are definitely part of my collection.
Oh, nice.
Very well, we went to visit.
Awesome.
So I got to ask Tracie, have you switched over to the Uncle Nearest yet?
In what way?
The glass.
Oh, yes, I did. Yes.
I was just checking because we hadn't gotten that far yet.
Actually, I held it up so everyone could see it when I did it.
I just didn't see you pouring it, so I wasn't sure if it switched over yet or not.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we got to make sure we keep everybody happy here.
Will you be relocating to Tennessee or are you going to stay in DC?
Well, the issue. So this program is basically just to provide the education, right? So it's getting me empowered and ready to do this role, but I don't have a job at the end. So I finish this and then I am up for hire anywhere. I am hoping that I can head to a specific distillery and make some inroads in someone that's doing new things in the industry. But honestly, who knows what might happen at the end of this. And I may realize like, I actually want to go somewhere else, or I want to do something a little bit different. This is just a year to a year and a half apprenticeship to gain all of this knowledge and experience. And then we'll see what happens. But I do
Tracie, send your resume to Jane. You've got the email address. Jane will send it on to Chicago. And we'll get you into Beam Suntory.
I mean, the distilleries, you guys, yeah.
I'm kidding, of course.
Pretty.
As Erica Marshall points out, Tracie is a legend. We still talk about the virtual tasting event in June. Tracie, you're going to be a success wherever you wind up. And I can't wait to see the whiskeys you come up with.
Thank you so very much, Mark. It has been my honor to be able to change the face of whiskey. It's what I've been doing since the beginning. It was the goal, and to see it actually coming to fruition is beyond my wildest dreams.
Well, this has been a hoot, frankly, because you guys are among my favorite people in the whiskey industry, because I always enjoy talking to you, Jane, and to you, Tracie. And this is the first time I've had a chance to talk to Garrett. And as Tabitha Adams points out, hire this woman now.
I need the experience first. Give me some time.
We'll get you the experience first. You're going to be fine. Don't worry about it. If Pickerel can do this, you can do it.
Cheers to that. I'm just kidding.
Hey, Pickerel.
And I kid because Dave's an old friend.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
To Dave.
He trained me. Yeah. I spent my first 2 months learning the ropes from him. So he was a good one.
Yeah.
And Tracie, I know you learned from Dave too.
I did. He has touched all of our lives. Yep. I mean, he was he's been a part of so many people's lives in this industry.
So thank you for doing this, guys.
Thanks for having
let's
me.
let it go because we've gone an hour and 20 minutes here, and Jane's got a kid to feed, and Tracie's got whatever you've got going on tonight.
I'm an auntie. I can do whatever I want. I can
I hear that.
And walk around my building.
And Graham points out a stint at a Scotch whiskey distillery would be a great option for Tracie. Well, you've been to Glenfiddich, so we got to get you around Kentucky and Tennessee first.
I'm doing that first, but I'm still not mad at going back to Scotland. Are you kidding me? I'll come over anytime, guys.
As will I, when we can all do it without having to quarantine.
Yes, of course. Absolutely.
Well, thank you both for doing this. And thanks again to Garrett Oliver from the Michael James Jackson Foundation. Let's get that straight.
Right.
To avoid any conflict with the one-gloved wonder, who goes by the same name or went by the same name. But thanks again for doing this, guys. And we'll say goodbye here for just a second here. I want to give you a pointer about what's coming up on Friday night, because we've been doing our writers roundtables. Well, we're going to do a brand ambassadors roundtable. And I've pulled 4 people who have a lot of war stories to tell. We're going to have Colin Dunn from the Classic Malts, the legendary Queen of Canadian Whiskey, Tish Harkis from Canadian Club, David Blackmore of Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, and Sailor Guevara of Uncle Nearest will be joining us on the Friday night happy hour webcast. That is coming up at Friday night, 5:00 p.m. New York time, 4 p.m. Tennessee time, 10 p.m. London time, 2100 GMT. Oh, hell. It's hard keeping up with all these time zones around the world. But you know where to find it, guys. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks again to our guests, Garrett Oliver from the Michael Jackson Foundation for Brewing and Distilling, Tracie Oliver, the first fellow in the Uncle Nearest, the Nearest and Jack Advancement Initiative, and our pal Jane Bowie from the Maker's Mark Distillery, the Director of Innovation there. I'm Mark Gillespie. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you on Friday night, gang. Good night, all.
Cheers.